Is a Fireside Chat. We have Claude Achkar, who is the founder and managing partner of Actel Consulting. And we also have Jared Nink, who's the CEO of Vocus. I'm sure you know both these gentlemen, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Claude and Jared. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm on. Great. So my name is Claude Achkar. Pleased to be here. It's, like Helen earlier on from Sunny Vision, I'm based in Hong Kong. So it's my first. Oh, I've done a conference actually in Hong Kong maybe a couple of months ago, but it didn't feel like a conference really with mandatory masks and you can't even have a sip of water, let alone. So this is really back to normal here in Singapore, which is great. Jared is the Chief Executive Officer of Wholesale and International at Vocus, which is an Australian company. This session is Intra-Asia cables. So maybe I'll ask first Jared to still start by talking about Australia as a base, and then from there we'll branch into Asia.
Thanks, Claude, and good afternoon, everyone. We've seemed to have lost our friends on stage here. It's just down to two. It's like a Survivor, kind of dropping people as we go. Yes, Jared Nink's my name, CEO of Wholesale and International. I think Chris promoted me to CEO of Vocus Group, but that's not quite the title. Really excited to be here at Capacity Asia in Singapore. Exciting topic to talk about. From, I guess, my perspective is very much the Australian landscape. Obviously with our Australia-Singapore cable going up to Jakarta and Singapore, a little bit of experience in that part of Asia. Probably a little bit limited experience beyond that, but happy to share whatever insights I can.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Australia is a very vast, it's a continent, so plenty of connectivity requirements. Just talk very briefly about your base there and why you're branching out of Australia and when you started doing that.
Okay, thanks. For those who don't know, we're a dedicated fibre company in Australia. We have about 30,000 kilometres of fibre. We are very much focused on expansion at the moment, so a big domestic network, a subsea network going from Perth to Singapore, and a few projects going on that are subsea based, which we're quite excited about. I think rewind back 18 months ago, we were taken private by financial investors, Macquarie Asset Management and Aware Super, a very large superannuation company in Australia. And they basically said, let's accelerate the plan to extend the network out where customers want it. So we've got a couple of projects on the western side of Australia, so connecting our ASC cable back into Port Hedland, so creating a brand new cable landing station and point of entry into the country, and diversity from our ASC cable down through Perth. We're connecting from Perth back up to Port Hedland. And on the east coast, we're creating a new diverse subsea route between Sydney and Melbourne. So in the Australian context, I guess they're our two biggest cloud regions, Sydney and Melbourne. So creating diversity from the terrestrial systems with the subsea build there. Looking further north into Asia, we're also looking at two major builds from Darwin. We have a subsea cable from Darwin to Port Hedland. We're looking to head north to both Timor-Leste and to Kupang in southern Indonesia. So a few investment plans. Why are we doing it? Very much around customer-led strategy, whether it be Sydney to Melbourne is directly for cloud providers and domestic carriers who need big bandwidth between the two largest population centres. Looking at between Perth and Port Hedland, very much around network diversity for all of our customers. Looking at Port Hedland out to ASC that connects essentially Darwin to Singapore. That's around creating more diversity, creating new connections to the oil and gas industry off Australia's northwest coast. as well. So there's some of the projects and some of the reasons why we're investing in new subsea cables.
Attending a submarine conference is a lesson in geography, isn't it? So traditionally, the hub, if we're going to call it hub, to pick up on the previous session, west is Perth. So now there is a second one.
So in Australia, I guess the hubs, and it's probably we should be fined $1 every time we say hubs. It's been very widely used this week. But on the east coast, Sydney is very much the central landing point, and Perth on the west coast. So I think what's emerging is more of a direct connection between Australia and the rest of Asia from the north end, both Darwin, Port Hedland. Yeah.
But for the sake of this session here, which is Intra-Asia, it's mostly west and north, right? Perth and Darwin versus Sydney?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So what are the drivers here in expansion branching out of Australia, your home market, into Asia here? How do you choose? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a question of demand. So where are you seeing the demand here?
Yeah, I think there's a few key demand drivers that have been touched upon today. I think the rise of cloud services is obviously key. That's also precipitating OTT providers building their own cable systems, and we heard about that earlier. There's probably another factor we see, which is this concept of sovereignty, country sovereignty, looking at wanting cables that are owned by businesses in that home country. So more bespoke investments around this sovereign concept. And also beyond the cable systems, we're also seeing, I read a stat this morning that I think published by Equinix that said 99% of the international communications is carried by subsea cables. I think what we're going to see in the future is this rise of LEO satellite connections as well, which I don't, we can debate how much they'll eat into that 99% pie, but that's certainly going to be a growth factor as well in the region.
Right, yeah. So the second point that you mentioned is regulatory. It's the regulator imposing.
Yeah, so I think with the concept of sovereignty comes also regulatory requirements around where data is stored and handled, over what sort of cable systems.
Data residency.
Yeah, so data residency. So I think there's some of the main demand drivers. Obviously the spike, Ubaid mentioned this earlier, the spike in usage through COVID has just accelerated this kind of digital adoption in most economies. So that's kind of accelerated by several years, I think. The move to cloud, the use of these cloud-based services. So I think what we're saying is that growth is not going back to old levels, it's going well beyond.
So Indonesia and Singapore. Singapore is perhaps the obvious because it is where a lot of cables go, and then from there connecting to the rest of Asia and India and so forth, as we were talking earlier. Indonesia is just because of its fundamental importance for Australia, as its geographical proximity. What is it that prompts you to go in there?
So when we built the Australia-Singapore cable, we traversed through Indonesian waters and landed in Anyer, a landing station there. And what we've actually found is in the last, probably going back 2 to 3 years ago, connections between Singapore and Jakarta were some of the highest growing portions of the internet, and that was a kind of a secondary market that we weren't probably originally focused on when building the cable, but there's been huge demand through that corridor, which we've experienced.
And what's the reason of that traffic? What's driving it?
I think back to your point, population's so huge. It's being, more data centers are opening up in Jakarta, and just growth between those two markets.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of data centers, Jared, is it Is it, in your opinion, is it data centers driving growth in subsea, or the subsea cable comes, which then kicks off the development of data centers? Which is which?
Yeah, I think the cables used to then drive the data centers, particularly the international ones, but it's more, I'd say, more symbiotic these days, where, you know, if you're building infrastructure into new areas, be it from the data center perspective or from the cable owner perspective, you will collaborate typically with the other to figure out how you create an ecosystem. And I think part of the drive here is to create rich digital ecosystems. So you don't want a data center with no fiber, you don't want fiber with no data center. So it's more a symbiotic collaboration, I suppose. And more so, we'll be asked by data center providers just to do a bespoke build to a new facility that they're looking to build ahead of having that facility built. So it's often now the fiber being asked to be delivered bespoke for a specific data center build.
Right, okay. So we talked about content origination in certain countries. There's the 5G networks, which is driving traffic. We talked about data residency. There is also performance requirements that require latency and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you do have certain industries, sectors that look at latency very specific. So your high volume trading, your gaming, these sorts of applications. It's really important across the board, but I think when you're having multiple paths, and it's more about redundancy and resiliency these days, particularly I think for the cloud providers who want to make sure they have as close to 100% uptime as possible. So having probably 4 paths between 2 endpoints is more important than having one super fast, low latency pathing.
Exactly. Okay, Jared. I think I'd like to switch now the conversation a little bit to something that I have not heard earlier on in the previous 2 sessions, which is the current environment in which we live in today. It's not, I mean, during the pandemic, as we know, COVID, I mean, the whole industry, digital infrastructure got turbocharged. You know, if you keep reading that in 6 months, it was, you know, development equivalent of 3 to 6 years were done in 6 months, and so on and so forth. Today, there is a lot of headwinds, multiple headwinds, cost of capital, the geopolitical headwinds, you know, China tech downturn has been going on for a couple of years. In the US, Meta, right here, I'm pointing at you, has laid off. It's still a small number compared to the total number that were hired during the pandemic, but it's no longer gung-ho hiring. It's into cost control, and others, Amazon and Google and everybody else is doing the same. So given all of these headwinds, Jared, is the risk increasing today? Is that factoring in today more so than it did 6-9 months ago?
Look, I'd say if you rewound 12 months ago, we were at Vocus looking very carefully at the press. There was a new cable announcement every week for about 12 weeks. And interest rate environment was low, inflation environment was low, and there was a lot of focus in the finance community on fiber as an asset class, and a lot of high valuations. We got bought, Zayo in the US got bought. Like, there's a lot of financial money coming into fiber. Fast forward to today, and yes, you've got inflation's been running hot in the last 12 months. You've had certain economies looking to go into a downturn at the moment, some layoffs coming around with that. To counter the inflationary effects, you've got central banks raising interest rates. That's increasing the cost of capital. That's putting a little bit of a cloud over certain business cases, certain projects, or at least forcing companies to take a more cautious stand. With inflation, obviously the cost for the projects goes up. So factoring that into the business case also needs to be looked at. Some supply chain issues, as we all know about, with electronics as well, ships as well. So it is tricky. I'd say it is difficult. Demand's still there, but the risks, I'd say, have probably heightened.
Yeah, speaking of ships as well, I understand there's a scarcity of cable laying ships as well, which is not just for cable laying, but also for cable maintenance. Cables do break for a variety of reasons, and ships are required to go and repair those cables. So is that something that could be presenting yet another headwind, availability of those ships?
Yeah, absolutely, and we see that's one of the actually longest lead times in projects is just getting commitments from the ships and getting that early and having the relationships to be able to be prioritised in the queue. So that's definitely a risk issue or a lead time issue to manage.
And how about the cost, the material cost of the cable? Is that gone up as well?
I'd like to say not, but I think yes, for the most part, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned earlier this year, a couple of months period when there was almost about a cable announced per week, and this is all categories, but touching with Asia. I think I've made the count, and if I'm not mistaken, there's maybe 10 cables at the moment, Intra-Asia, that have been announced that have not gone RFS yet. 10. That's a lot of cables that are supposed to come on stream. Maybe some will not come. So I mean, let's be honest and talk. It's not all rosy at the moment. I mean, the industry has gone tremendously, and there has been a lot of supply. So managing the risk, given it's so capital intensive, and the return on investment is extremely important, and generating those sales to get the commitment to launch a new cable. So I don't know if you want to comment on that further, Jared.
No, that's absolutely right. And things like thinking, so factoring in all those costs and those risks and the funding into the business case is important from a life cycle perspective before you get started. There's obviously the ships in terms of the lead time in the construction, and then throughout just making sure you've got the anchor customers who are going to take the capacity. You've got a way to monetize that. And factoring in, there are a lot of potential customers building their own cable systems as well to make sure. So I think some tips around that is making sure you know where your customers need to be and where their demand lies is I think at the heart of helping shape that business case.
Okay. Anyone has any questions here for us? If not, what else I wanted to talk about? Let me see. I mean, we started this conversation, and I believe the two earlier sessions were very much about new hubs, growth and so forth, and we talked about that for the first half here, but it's important to talk also about how to manage risk, how to assess risk, and how to manage risk as well. And by the way, about hubs, my own personal opinion here is that we're living in a post-hub era at the moment. If you remember the question in the previous panel, what are the next hubs in Asia Pac? And every country was mentioned. Every country was mentioned, Indonesia, Taiwan, Philippines, Japan already a hub, of course, Korea, etc. So if every country is a hub, then I think we're living in a post-hub era here, and it's very diversified. Meta is building cables now directly from the US, along with Google and other partners, to Southeast Asia for the first time. This has never happened before, so bypassing traditional hub into going straight into Indonesia and so forth. So I don't know if you want to add anything else to this thought.
No, I think those locations will continue to thrive because the history shows that they can, but there's going to be more of a mesh network design around where new forms of traffic need to pass or where improved resilience needs to go. So gone are the days when heavy buyers of capacity just need one path. They need up to 3 or 4 these days. So that means you can actually use various midpoints to get you there, or you could just take entirely different paths. So I think we're going to see a bit more of a flattening of that kind of hub architecture.
Exactly. All right. Okay, so I guess it's the last session of the day here. So if there are no questions from the audience, then we'll thank you all for being with us here, and maybe we'll see you tomorrow then for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claude, Jared, for taking the stage there.